episode for season 14. Mentioned in dispatches, we're back for more. We are in the thick of our 14th season of doing this, and appreciate everybody here joining us for the listen. And we're going to talk tonight. We're going to do a deep dive into the Operational Combat Series, so the OCS games. And look, because it's me and I don't know really squat about, I know the generalities of them, but we needed a couple of subject matter experts on this, and someone who could pontificate at length on OCS. And since he will pontificate at length on just about any topic we throw his way, we brought Gary back. Ardwolf, how you doing, man?
I'm sorry, what?
Yeah, exactly. And then joining us, the person who first taught me really anything about OCS, which isn't a whole lot back then, but probably the max of what I actually do know about it. James Sterrett is here. James, how you doing?
I'm doing okay. I should note, by the way, that I am an Army civilian working in wargaming, and the opinions that I have here bear no relation to anything that the Army of the U.S. government might conceivably have, and anyone who tries to claim otherwise will be mocked.
Yes. And with both me and Gary here, we can provide some mockery. That is not a problem at all.
There you go.
We are well versed in the skills of mockery.
Ozarski's more fun to mock, though, to be fair.
Well, on occasion, yes. Partly because Jim can give as well as he takes. So.
Oh, sure. But okay, cool.
Yeah,
I'm happy to participate in that tomfoolery.
That's part of the entertainment value of it all. So in terms of the OCS games themselves, the vast majority of folks listening to this are probably the OCS fans who want to hear folks talk about the games they love. But for the fans of the podcast who may not be intimately familiar with the Operational Combat Series, these are primarily World War II, a stray Korea game snuck out there. We're going to talk about that a little bit here in a few minutes. But Gary, if you don't mind, like the thumbnail sketch of OCS in terms of scale and scope and the intent of the series, as briefly as we can summarize for the folks that may not know what the Operational Combat Series is all about.
Well, that's a whole lot of requests there, Brent.
I get it. Like that's most of the podcast, but let's try and get
right. Well, all I'm saying is you're going to need to give me a minute here. So there are 22 games out in the Operational Combat Series. The system was designed originally by Dean Essig in the early 90s, perhaps. Something like that, 89, 90, 91, that general neighborhood. First game of the series was Guderian's Blitzkrieg. The second game onward can all be played with the current rules, with a very small number of modifications that can be found on the Gamers Archive website. I think the original intent was to provide kind of a 20th century combat system of games. And we didn't really see very much of that. All of the games are about World War II or closely related topics, except for OCS Korea, which is the Korean War from 50, what would it be, Brant? 50, 51, something like that?
50 to 53 was the whole scope of the war. But
yeah, I don't think this one goes that far, as most Korean War games do not.
Yeah.
But I think if you ask people about what the signature features of OCS are, one of those features is the scale of the game itself, right? The fact that you've got this big 4 or 6 or whatever it is map game, right? Very few war games provide you with that sense of grandeur that OCS can, in those big games, give you. Another one of the things that people talk about is the focus on what they will call logistics, and for the sake of having a written rule set, Dean called logistics too. The supply system. It's known for that supply system, which a lot of people bounce off of because they don't think it's reasonable to want to count points and maintain them on the board. And, I have some sympathy with that. However, when asked, I was interested to see that Dean himself, when asked what he considered the signature innovation of OCS, he said the surprise mechanic. And that is a mechanic that I almost bounced off of, way back in the day, because it seems like it won't work. And then when you start using it, you find out it works great. It provides a certain amount of variability and unpredictability to the combats that you don't really get in some other games, right? and it shines best on the East Front. Scale is regiments to divisions, depends on exactly what game we're talking about. The East Front scale is 5 miles to the hex. The West Front scale is 2.5 miles to the hex. So it's a pretty granular game. How's that?
Fair enough. James, did he miss anything? Something he should have had?
I think it really asks you to think like an operational commander. And this arguably slides into one of your next questions, but certainly one of the things that initially made me sit up and take notice was the supply system. And that was back in the Guderian's Blitzkrieg version. So if you want me to start into sort of some of those stories and why I liked it, then I will do that, or I will hold them for later.
Well, just really quickly, I mean, a lot of folks that have been reading the Dragoons website for a while know that I will occasionally pontificate about logistics in wargaming and how many wargames don't do a particularly good job of it, largely because for a lot of folks, logistics is simply moving material around the map, when there's a lot more involved in logistics than that. It's just not all that particularly sexy to put in a game. And truthfully, even moving material around the map isn't all that sexy. It serves as an inhibitor on, people just running wild and doing whatever the hell they feel like. One of my sort of pet gripes largely has always been people confuse realism and granularity. And I think OCS, largely, my exposure to it has been that it does a good job of not getting overly granular. It provides some specific parameters where you have to move logistics around the map in order to support the actions you want to take, but stops there. And you're not managing by like bullet caliber or type of gasoline, like some games do and claim to be realistic. So that's been my limited exposure to it, that the logistics system for someone who's ever dealt with real logistics systems is simplified, but it's done so, I think, to good service within what the game is trying to do.
So to sort of push in on that, there's a number of challenges you have to deal with sort of at a high level in running a supply system to get stuff forward. You have to know how much is coming to you. You have to know what your frontline demand is. You have to know how much transport assets of various kinds you've got to make things move, and what the routes that you can take things down on, and how far you can get things before you've got to, in effect, tick over another time box of whatever your planning time horizon is. And you've got to figure out how you're keeping all of it secure. And OCS fundamentally makes you wrestle with all of that.
Yeah.
You've got various kinds of transport assets that have varying capabilities to move stuff at varying speeds over various routes. You've got to worry what those routes are. You've got to worry how much you've got coming in. You've got to worry what the demand is. You've got to worry how to keep it secure. And on top of that, and getting back to the operational commander, you've got to figure out where it needs to either go and or be stockpiled so that you can do the maneuver things that you are doing in order to win. And if you can't solve the logistics problem, you will lose.
Fair enough. So how do we solve the logistics problem?
Well, we could tell you how Dean solved it. I mean, with supply points that you get and have to move around the map to fill your supply needs. And I mean, for some people, this was probably kind of a revelatory mechanic back in the day, right? Because all those I had been introduced to games with command control problems with squad leader. In many games, even to this day, there's essentially no restrictions on, operational constraints on what your units can accomplish in any given turn. And therefore you'd see, big games where you just conduct attack after attack after attack after attack down the line, wherever you could get odds that look remotely plausible. OCS forces you to make operational decisions about you can't fight with everybody. You just can't. Yeah. So you have to decide where you're going to fight. And I enjoy the decision space that OCS provides in this respect.
And it's the right decision space. They make you worry about class 3 and class 5, about ammunition and fuel. Ammunition is class 5, fuel is class 3.
For folks that are curious about the classes of supply, look on the notes on this this episode, and I've got the link to the logistics article that explains what all those are.
I have literally forgotten these details already.
You're welcome. But those are the two big drivers for the ability to conduct maneuver. You got to be able to fuel your systems. You got to have ammunition to do that. It does a very nice job of showing the relative weight of what things consume. You will find that artillery eats ammunition like nobody's business, that armored mechanized formation fuel like nobody's business, as they should, right? They suck down things like there's no tomorrow. In the modern day, a armored brigade combat team will burn more fuel in a day than a light infantry combat team does in a year. So significant difference there.
Assuming your tanks are doing things, which they should be.
Assuming they are, but if it's M1s, they're burning it just standing still too. If you turn on. But as a result, those become both the enabler and the brake on operations. And in the first one that they put out, Guderian's Blitzkrieg, one of the things that made me very happy was that the Germans run to the end of their supply tether at about Tula, which is what they ought to be doing. That's the limit of their operational reach. It's where they're going to run dry. And as the German player, you're sitting there saying, if only I could get more forward, then I could keep pushing on. And you just can't do it because they didn't have the logistical throughput capability to sustain themselves in that long a drive.
Spoken like Guderian.
Absolutely. In the first game that came out, you also had to worry about food, about class 1, and you would move up vast mountains of food for your troops to eat every turn, which personally, there's a side of me that really liked that as an educational thing. Although in terms of gameplay, they were probably correct to move to the trace supply and you assume away the food. It gets folded into reducing your transport allocation fundamentally, so that you don't have to move stuff up and watch it disappear every turn. Although there is a corner of my wretched little historian soul that loved that love process of moving all the food forward just to watch it be eaten, just so that you could do it all again next turn, and watching it use a great deal of your transport system just to keep your troops from starving to death.
Yeah.
I thought that was neat to watch, neat to do, but I also understand how, in terms of streamlining it as a game, it was the right move after the first game to trim that back.
To peel that out of there.
Yeah. And I guess I'm going to go on one of my notes about this. So at the time that the first game came out, I was in the process of writing my master's thesis on the Soviet Southwestern Front in 1941, essentially Army Group North Ukraine in 1941, summer 41. So I was writing about events that were pretty much the same in their dynamics as what the game was on. And I was awed by the fact that the dynamics of what happened in Guderian's Blitzkrieg 1, the first OCS game, matched what I was reading about and writing about better than anything I had ever seen before. Both with the logistics as a brake in the driver, that the balance of the capabilities of things like air power and artillery and ground power were about right. Unlike Gary, I did not bounce off the surprise mechanic initially, because one of the things that I very much liked was the way that the surprise and the quality and firepower terrain all linked together to create dynamics that seemed correct. So you could have a German Panzer battalion with a 5 out on a scale of 0 to 5 action rating, effectiveness, quality rating, which would then have massive advantages as it plowed into a numerically and firepower-wise superior Soviet tank division. And if everything went right, then it would beat up that division. But if anything went wrong, and it could, because the surprise roll could occasionally go against them, then that Panzer battalion was going to evaporate. Boom. And for all that it could beat up that tank division, the tank division had staying power due to its sheer numbers. It had more steps. And therefore, it might take some beating before you actually destroyed the thing, for all that you could outmaneuver it tactically in a level that's below the scale of the game, other than the representation of the effectiveness number.
Yeah.
Yes, Jim, you knew that already. I didn't at the time in 1992 or whatever it was, 92, 93. So, my experience with it was limited to looking at wargame maps. I had not even been camping at that point.
Oh, my. I'll not pay attention to that. I feel old now. The other
I
thing
think that's more that Gary just didn't get out much as a kid.
Well, that's what I'm saying. I was like 23 at the time, so I wasn't like a youngster exactly at the time.
the terrain also is accounted for very nicely in that the benefits that various forces get for attacking into or defending in various kinds of terrain really match what it is that they are good at. And you are going to be penalized for taking armor in, saying, hey, tanks without any support, let's send them into the downtown core. Yeah, that's a mistake, and the game will make it a mistake and will hand you your head for it. Equally, and at some point, I'm going to want to sort of talk about the sort of the nifty factors of the way the combat table is built. So if you want me to rant about that now, then I will.
Hold off on that rant for just a second.
I will. All right.
I am curious some of Gary's reactions to the thoughts you've just laid out there on the table for us.
Well, again, in 1992 or 1993, this kind of thing would have been completely over my head, which is why I didn't get it and at the time, and why I ended up getting rid of the first couple of games that I had, even though they looked intriguing in a lot of ways. And I didn't get back into OCS until 2013, maybe something like that. So, I've been playing for about 10 years at this point. And it is a relatively recent development that I'm able to recognize those kinds of factors, because I've read more military history now than I had 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes it just takes playing some other games to develop an appreciation of what that one's trying to put in front of you.
That's surely a factor too. Yeah.
So
and I, played a fair amount of different stuff, including a few odds and ends that are other big, East Front things, in those same 10 years. And that is absolutely illuminating as well.
Yeah. One of the things that I had made mention of in some, look, I actually prepared for stuff and put a couple of show notes together to make sure that I was staying in the conversation with you guys, but to make sure I was throwing semi-intelligent questions at y'all about OCS. To go back to something James had mentioned when you were talking about, at a certain point, the Germans sort of run out of gas, out of juice, out of their logistical tail, that they kind of hit their limit of advance, and that's it. OCS, James, as you have mentioned, and Gary, as you later came to learn, does a pretty good job of replicating some of that actual history. I guess the question in there is that necessarily inherently a good thing, in that does OCS put you too much on rails because of those constraints, or how far afield can you stretch from what historically happened to kind of writing a new chapter? Can the Germans find a way to optimize the supply chain to actually get a little further? Can they disrupt the Russian reinforcement of Stalingrad? I'm throwing out a bunch
those things can absolutely happen.
Yeah.
And I've always found from the OCS games I've played, which is a decent number, and the OCS games that I've read after action reports on, I've always found the final result, and I've observed a lot of OCS games too while I'm playing something else, and these 15 guys are playing Ostfront at Winterfest, which will be this weekend, in fact. I've always found the results that you get out of that narrative that OCS generates in the larger context of the entire game that you just played to be historically plausible. And I have the sense that Jim would agree with that statement, and that makes me feel better about it.
I do agree. Are there extremes to which you probably can't drive the events in a game? Yes, there's left and right limits imposed by the system. Could you recreate the historical result in the game? Absolutely. So it passes the Jim Dunnigan test of, can a historical game recreate the historical result? Are you going to be railroaded down exactly the historical path? No. And you don't necessarily even want to be, depending on the game, right? There's a lot of different games in the series, so I'm sort of picking my way carefully on that statement. In part because there's times when the historical commanders made mistakes and you have the option of not necessarily making that mistake, in part because of things you don't know. For all that OCS makes a stab at limited intelligence, you still know, even if you're playing shell games and have lots of hidden units off the map, you still know far more than your historical counterparts did about what was facing. So you can do a great deal more math.
Well, you know that just by opening the box.
Exactly. And you know the order of battle. You have clearly defined objectives. I mean, you know what the capabilities of your own units are to a T. So
Yeah.
you can do sort of the science of war in a way that your historical counterparts would have given a major limb to be able to do, because they simply can't do it. And while some of that is mitigated by things like the surprise roll, some of it is inherent in playing a war game with a rigid set of rules.
Well,
So
and
I will point at one game that has tried to break this recently. The new version of Aaron Armour Würzburg comes with a set of rules in which you don't know where your own units are, which I'm
yeah.
intrigued to give a try, because it really breaks your ability to do pre-calculated math, and instead forces you to try and work the situation, if you will. I hope. I haven't tried it yet. But back to OCS.
Yeah, friendly fog of war is a hard thing to do in war games.
Yes.
It's just run a Kriegspiel.
That is
Yeah.
a great way to get lots of friendly fog of war.
Yep.
James, you're talking about, as the commander, far more than your historical counterparts did. That's absolutely valid in any war game that you're playing. The flip side of that is it doesn't necessarily impart an automatic advantage to you as the commander, because your opponent does also. So
that's true, but it allows you
things out.
It allows you to do combat math in a way
Yes.
that I think to a precision that they could not. I can sit there and say, I've got an N to 1, and I look at the tables, or I throw this much artillery at it, and I look at the tables, and I know what my probable outcomes are. It's not I have some historical experience based on whatever I've done that makes me think that I'm going to get a given result, or I've got as many tubes of artillery as I can line up, and I hope it's enough. I know that this is enough, and I can finesse breakpoints in the charts. And honestly, when we do that, we are playing the game as opposed to playing the history.
Fair point.
I like the OCS fog of war mechanic, but it is not a serious simulation of fog of war in any fantastical sense, right? It's a practical hand wave at fog of war is what it is. It works great, by the way, but it is a practical hand wave for the sake of having an actual game you can play.
And for those who don't know, the simplest part of this practical hand wave is that any given stack of units that you are adjacent to, you are allowed to look at the top combat capable unit. Full stop. You can't go powering through the stack. You can't see how many steps it's got. Top combat capable unit, and it ends. And if it's further back than that, what you get to see is the top thing in the stack, which hides things nicely. You still see the size of the stack. I have played games of OCS in groups in which we took a lot of the big stacks and put them into off-map holding boxes with a replacement marker on the map to sort of hide the size, which was frankly pretty cool, but it's also a lot more work.
Well, it's more work, but it may also not be that may even be more artificial than leaving the stack on the map, because
and to be fair, you can manage this in your copious downtime.
Yeah. Fair, but I mean, the dumbest scout in the world can look over the hill and see a giant dust cloud and go, holy crap, there's a lot of stuff over there.
Yeah, and you can see the sides of the counters, so you know where the supply is. The last couple of games have included 0 step loss markers, so you can have a dummy step loss marker under the unit, because you can a lot of times tell that there's a step down anyway. And I think they may actually have included, I have to check Forgotten Battles for this, I think they may have included 0 supply point markers too. You can have dummy supply dumps.
I'd put in those show notes one of the things to ask you guys about, but then after I'd sent the email, like I was mulling it over my head and kind of almost answered my own question. I had noted that thus far, OCS is all World War II except for the one Korea game. There hasn't been any attempt to go backwards at all to earlier conflicts, but there's not really been much attempt to go forward beyond Korea into modern warfare at all, post Cold War and more current. And at first I was thinking, hey, is this a failing of the system? Does this show that the system can't truly handle anything beyond that? Is it actually more limited than people realize? But then I was thinking, well, after Korea, where's the next actual conflict to which you could really apply the OCS system with its management of largely mechanized forces. Like you go back far enough, they just don't exist. You go forward past Korea, and like you're not going to use this for a Vietnam game. I don't think there's a whole lot of sub-Saharan Africa where it would apply.
73.
Yeah, well, and that's the question: is if you go to the Middle East, are the environments large enough that an OCS game would actually fit on there? The Sinai, I would think it would, but does it scale correctly that you could play the Syria side of an Israel, of one of the wars in Israel? Does the Golan Heights in that area scale well enough that you could do it? Like the Middle
I
East.
bluntly do not know enough about this topic to answer that question. But what I can tell you is that Valley of Tears was originally intended as a OCS game, and Carl ended up doing it as a BCS game instead, and that is the Valley of Tears that we got. So that might tell us something about BCS being a better fit for that particular topic than OCS would have been. And I think the scale is part of that. But remember that not every OCS game is at the same map scale, right? There's at least 2 different map scales, and I'm not sure what the map scale is off the top of my head of Burma. It might be 5 miles per hex, but I don't know. So, I mean, there is a little bit of wiggle room in that.
The smaller map scale are Western Front ETO.
Is that just because the terrain's more crowded?
Yeah, partly because the terrain's more crowded, partly because there's a higher density of forces often.
Okay, that would make sense.
Yeah, I could vouch for that.
Yeah.
So one, I think you could take this back to World War I and it would function. It might not be always an interesting game. I have never done more than sort of very short ponderings of whether or not you could take some of the maneuver sections of the Eastern Front of World War I and make it a OCS game that was worth playing. So I've not looked into that particularly hard, but the system as a whole would function. Something that Dean wrote early on, I don't know if it's still in the designer's notes or if it was in their operations magazine or something, was that when you get into the 60s, missiles mess up the system. And that sort of stuck with me, partly because it's a comment that back whenever it was made in the 90s made me go, really? And increasingly my answer has been, yeah, he was right. And the problem with missiles is that it screws up your supply system. And it does it because you've suddenly got really long range strike assets that, depending on the exact time you're looking at, either can only be defended by something else that's special or have no defense against them, that are, as we go forward in time, an increasingly precision asset for strike. So you can really wallop something with it. And yet their load in the logistics system is pretty limited. And instead, the problem is that the supply of ammunition for them, the rockets to put into them, the missiles to put into them, is very, very small because they're hard to make. Trying to balance that out when fundamentally the log system in theirs is built around mass and cube, would be difficult without introducing another form of supply you had to track in order to get the missiles up there. The other thing that would create trouble, I think, is the introduction of surface-to-air missile systems in numbers, so that given that so BCS for Valley of Tears hand waves the air war a great deal, and it can get away with that because it's really focused on ground tactical maneuver. Whereas OCS, you fight the air war and you can fight an air campaign. It's not as superbly well done as the ground war is. But if you were doing the Yom Kippur War in OCS, you would expect to have to fight the SAM suppression campaign by the Israelis, which means that now we got to have SAMs on the map, and they need supply, and their supply again is limited less by the volume throughput than it is by the number of systems of the amount of ammunition you can get forward to them.
Yeah.
So I can see that as being the place where the long-range missiles really start to mess things up, and you'd have to rethink a lot of the systems in order to get them further forward.
So it sounds like if you get much past Korea, that it's not necessarily OCS, but you could do an OCS-like thing so long as you rejiggered the logistics system to account for this new issue of the long-range precision strike, whether it's feeding ammo into it or somehow protecting against it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I think the thing, I believe the thing that it would have the most trouble with, I guess I'm thinking about this while I'm talking as well. One, there's the log issue, and two, it's not really built for precision strike attacks.
It's built for mass.
It's built for from mass attacks.
Yeah.
Because despite people being very happy about supposed results that personally, having done a PhD that covered World War II air power, I don't believe happened, of amazing results of death and destruction by TAC air in World War II. Fundamentally, it's a barrage system, and it's largely inaccurate and largely misses, which causes a lot of disruption and fear in the ground, and that's very, very useful to have the suppression. But it's not, hey, we're going to fire a Hellfire or a Maverick or whatever and have a much better PHPK when we shoot one piece of ordnance.
Yeah. So the 48 war in the Middle East, probably not so much because there wasn't a lot of maneuver. There was a lot of guerrilla and irregular sort of conflicts there, but maybe 56 in the Middle East might be the furthest forward you get.
I would guess yes.
So,
and ideally, you'd have Carl Fung on this. We could argue about it with him.
Well, maybe in a future, if we get Carl to show up to Origins one year, we'll put the three of y'all on an OCS panel and let y'all discuss it.
There you go.
I'd be delighted to do that.
I didn't think it would take much prodding to get you interested in that.
Our 14th season of Mentioned in Dispatches is made possible by all of our Patreon supporters, but especially our regimental patrons who supported us at the top level. Regiment of Strategy Gaming would like to thank Stagger Wing, Paul LaFontaine, Matthew Rowe, Joseph Knoll, Fred and our favourite podcast dog, Kevin Bertram, Catastrophe Games, Patrick Garrity, Michael Sunborg, Chet Bell and Andy J. Wargaming is our jam, and they help us spread it. You too can join the Armchair Dragoons as a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/armchairdragoons.
Gary, what do you, I know you would be perfectly happy just fighting East Front World War II stuff for the rest of your life, but any interest in trying to stretch OCS beyond that World War II and Korea paradigm?
If somebody, I think you might be, like Jim said, I'm not convinced that a World War I OCS game would be fun, but I do think it would basically work. And I would buy it if they did one, and I would probably try to play it if they did one. It might not end up being my favorite OCS game. That's all. But I do think that the system, to me at least, is the most fun in a medium to large East Front game for me.
Yeah.
But there's a couple of West Front ones I haven't played. Well, Med Front anyway. DAC. I haven't played DAC. And I actually think the Blitzkrieg Legend is really, really good. But I am less convinced that Beyond the Rhine doesn't have significant problems. Let me put it that way. Whereas every East Front OCS game I've played has been a good experience.
Interesting. So, James, before we come back around to you poking at some of the math and combat results tables and everything, a different topic that I wanted to bring up, and we've alluded to it a little bit with the logistics stuff with the more robust air game. So at Origins for a number of years now, and kind of you started this, so it's all your fault anyway, but yeah. But I was involved with it for a bunch of years until, I shuffled over to managing the Wargame HQ as a larger thing under which the CPXs were nested, where we've got these staff games that we run at Origins where we bring the players in and we give them different roles, the commander, the intel guy, the fires guy, the maneuver guy, the whatever. And we give them these roles, teach them how to put together those orders. It's the quick primer, right? We're not trying to teach them all of CGSC in, a 4-hour block, but we give them enough to get them started, coach them through the rest of it. But then the players collectively play as a team against our guys playing the OPFOR, and they got to fight their way through the battle in that command post kind of format. Not every one of those CPX roles would necessarily translate to OCS, but Gary, as you've described your multiplayer OCS games in the past, really the way you guys tend to split things up is, hey, you take the northern flank, you take the southern flank, I got the middle, and it's almost like Commands and Colors where each commander has their own board of the three zones of combat there, and everybody.
I think that is an astonishingly specious comparison, but okay.
Every now and then I just want to poke the badger with a spoon there.
Right.
But essentially you're doing everything. You're just doing it only on a part of the map instead of doing a part of the the overall role, but everywhere on the map. And so I guess, James, because you've been the lead on these CTXs, you would have better visibility into sort of how to split those roles into like the log guy, the maneuver guy, the fires guy, the air guy, like which roles we could actually try to replicate in OCS. But then, Gary, I'll throw it to you. Like, is that something you guys would even want to try in one of your bigger OCS games? Is that something that you think would be enjoyable for your run-of-the-mill OCS player? So I'll start with James, then we'll throw it over at Gary here.
No,
So-
let me go ahead.
So I also have been in multiplayer OCS games and multiple players per side, and it can work very, very well. Although the ones that I've been in have mostly been, much like the ones you were talking about from Aardwolf, have been you take this sector and I'll take that sector. But if I was going to build one more like a staff, I would start with you take this sector, you take that sector. So you're commanding this army and I'm commanding that army and so on and so forth. But then I would make somebody the air commander so that you don't have your personal little air force in your sector. It's one guy trying to figure out how to run the air war and support whatever the priority is. I'd put somebody in overall charge, and I would have somebody being the logistics officer who gets it from the edge of the map, if you will, into some effectively up to the point where your local army logistics takes over. So that if I were that guy, I'd be delivering it up to a set drop point for Gary, and then Gary deals with how he gets it forward to his units. And arguably, that means in OCS terms that I get it up to where his HQ then throws it forward to be used. But nonetheless, having somebody just run the transport system, particularly if everybody's playing on their side in parallel, I think would kind of speed up the game, much like having multiple people playing sectors in the front in parallel. And last, I think you can in fact have an interesting role for somebody to try to be piecing together not just what's going on with the enemy now, but doing that deep dive into trying to get into the other side's head and figure out what it means and where they're going and how you counter it. So somebody actually doing the two job might well be an interesting task.
So, Gary, is that something that you think might appeal to some of the OCS guys you have gamed with? And if so, how might you go about it? Look, it's too close to Winterfest to try and introduce it there, but is that something that you think would be entertaining to try sometime?
Well, Winterfest happens to be one of the places where I think an OCS game big enough to support this occurs. So I think it is an ideal thing to conduct that ideal venue to conduct that experiment. On the other hand, I'm not sure those particular guys would fall for it. They are, they've been doing this for a while, and they know the way they do it, and they all do it the same way, and everybody's happy. But I'm not sure. I think you would need a pretty big OCS game to pull it off, right? To make it if fun and to give everybody as much to do as possible. The reason why I think OCS splits most commonly just by sector of the map is because the labor of OCS is the counters, right? So splitting the labor means splitting the counters. And sometimes there'll be like a de facto central air command, and like one person will just handle the air in something like a Blitzkrieg Legend where there might be two players per side. One person's got the French army, one person's got the Dutch and Belgians and the French Air Force, right? We've done things like that before. But when we ran Europa at Origins, we had an air commander. So I mean, we've done that at least to a limited extent, even in our casual way. But I do think, some of the bigger titles in. I don't know about the individual titles. I think most of them are probably not big enough to give everybody enough to do without a lot of sitting around while the guys in charge of moving counters move counters, right? But I think you could probably do it with Ostfront, right? And perhaps Case Blue and GB2 combined as well. And, that's the kind of thing we see at Winterfest every year.
Okay. Yeah. So it's Winterfest would be the place to do it, but for the personalities there that are, would rather you just get off their lawn and quit.
Well, you might go to sound much crabbier than they actually are. They're a jovial lot, but I'm not sure they would buy it.
The reports you give me of the guys that are there, right?
Well, and the other thing is that big Ostfront game is a play test, right? So I'm not sure Tony would be open to opening that up to this experiment is what I'm saying. Yeah. Once everything is released and we can just play with our production copies, then sure, by all means, I think I could sell it.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to muck with someone's playtest. That is absolutely a fair statement, and no, we should not do that to him. But you're the one that's frequently portrayed the denizens of Winterfest as barely entering the 20th century, much less the 21st on occasion. So.
Me? I have said no such thing.
Sure. No,
I mean, it's an older crowd. I mean, I've said that because it is an older crowd. What do you want me to tell you? There's like one guy who's in his mid to late 20s, and everybody else is 50 plus.
Yeah, he's the one.
I might be missing somebody, but I'm not. I don't think so.
Let's go. James, let's circle back around to your thing you were talking about a little earlier with regards to some of the combat tables and the parameters there. It is a way to get away from that perfect game math to maybe have more variability built into the combat tables themselves, that maybe one of your die rolls determines whether you're using chart A, B, or C that are all slightly different than each other?
So no, which is a good thing. I'm perfectly happy to not have to go to chart A, B, or C based on a die roll. But the primary combat table for ground combat for OCS incorporates a lot of variability, and it incorporates a lot of double tapping of variables usefully, and it incorporates a lot of player decisions. So let me unpack some of that. First, it double taps unit quality. You begin any combat with, you figure out the odds, but you also figure out whether or not there's going to be surprise on either side. And surprise could be a 6-column shift in either direction in favor of the defender or the attacker. Usually, if you have surprise, it's going to go in favor of the side with better quality, because the quality difference is a direct modifier in your surprise probability. But it's not guaranteed. You could get bad surprises out of the system. And since the scale of that surprise could be large,
I disagree with Jim. When I am rolling the dice, it is never a surprise.
Well, I hear you, and my wife bought me a shirt that said "Bad die rolls happen to good players," for a very good reason, because they certainly often go against me. But nonetheless, when you sit there and you do the math on I'm going to attack at this particular set of odds, you also know that a surprise roll will, on average, shift it 3 columns left or right. So now you're looking at about half the table of what you might be there. In addition, it double taps the quality difference as a die roll modifier on your combat roll on the table. So that is inherently, given that it's largely a slanted table, it's its own sort of change there. There are 4 different sets of lines for odds on the table: for open terrain, for close terrain, very close, extremely close. Where open is sort of the steppes of the Eastern Front, and extremely close would be the downtown core of Stalingrad or Moscow or something. And while at the 1-to-1 in open, you see a 1-to-1, 2-to-1, 3-to-1, 4-to-1 stack there. At the upper end of the chart, if you want the rightmost best column for the attacker in the open, all you do is a 3-to-1. If you want that in extremely close terrain, dense urban core, you need a 52-to-1. So given that there are also modifiers to unit combat strength based on the terrain that they are in, it has deliberately double tapped terrain effects. And again, I think it does that correctly, and it does it to good effect. The third thing that I think is really just cool about the way the system works, and this is not, I think, unique, you'll see this in others, is that the system includes a mixture of required losses and options. And both sides must take their required losses, and then the attacker has to take their options, and then the defender has to take their options. And when the attacker takes their options, they can take those options as either retreats for the entire attacking force or as losses. And if they take any of their options as retreats, the defender can ignore all their options. So as the attacker, when you get the all too frequent result of attacker option 1, defender option 1, what are you going to do? How much do you want the hex that the defender's in? Are you willing to pay to take that, take the step loss, and then watch them say, I didn't really care about that hex that much. I'll pull back by 1. Haha, you can bleed again next turn. Or are they saying, no, we're standing and dying on this ground. You can bleed and we're going to bleed. So without any special rules for, is this a probe? Is this an all-out attack? Is this a delay? Is this a stand and die defense? It puts it back in your hands to decide how much you're willing to bleed for a given piece of terrain as the result comes in, which, again, I think is a pretty cool outcome of including some decision-making and sometimes some sweaty decisions into the combat system.
Gary, what do you think?
I agree with everything Jim said, including rolling dice very badly.
Hey, there is worldwide video evidence of my shitty die rolling, right?
Who says I've seen guys? I swear, clean living on some of these people. I'll tell you that just roll dice like the friggin' golden boy all the time. I play, I'm not going to say his name, but last one game I played several years ago, I rolled, this is GTS. If you roll 9s, it's bad, especially for like artillery where it might like knock it out for a while, as I recall. I rolled an average, I was checking by day 3. I rolled an average of 10 9s a day of playing this game. So I rolled like 9 like 100 times over the course of the whole week. This person, who I will call Mork, I think rolled 1 9 the entire fucking week. I was enraged. I almost flipped the table. The nicest man you'd ever want to meet or talk to. I almost flipped the table on him in rage when he rolled that 1 9 and then started complaining about it.
I can recall at a Buckeye Game Fest watching one of the guys in one of the Panzer Blitz Panzer Leader games having rolled his 5th or 6th 1 in the last, 20, 30 minutes, simply get up and walk out and go back to his room and just left the table for everyone else to clean up. He just gave up at that point. He was that frustrated about it all.
Oh, I've thrown dice across the room at Buckeye Game Fest. And let me say, kids, that is not acceptable behavior. Don't do that. Don't behave like an asshole.
The one good impact of bad die rolling is that somewhere in my early 20s, I came to realize that, in fact, I should stop blaming the dice, and I should start blaming me, and I should stop making plans that depended on good die rolls. And on the one hand, this meant that my planning got rather less flashy, but it also meant that when the dice do, and they do occasionally, right, the law of averages does kick in, go my way, then things go very well indeed. And I'm less surprised and less destroyed when things are going badly. So in fairness, there's a lesson to all of us in this. I suspect you guys have learned exactly the same lesson.
Oh, absolutely. That doesn't mean I don't get salty about it when it happens, though.
Yeah.
It is within my rights to get salty about it.
It's within the expectations that you will get salty.
Yeah, exactly. And we know who's in the room with us. We're expected to complain and then get over it. When it keeps happening for fucking days in a row, however, it's very hard to let go. Is all I'm saying.
This applies far more to RPGs than to war games where D20s are much more commonplace, but I have a solid metal D20 that I got in one of the RPG accessory somethings I bought over the many years. And that was always known as the Streak Buster die, that if you were just having a night of shitty die rolling, you could go to the Streak Buster and break that bad streak. Now, that doesn't mean it was rolling 20s all the time. If you needed a 13, it would roll you a 15, right? It was going to break the streak for you, but you couldn't go to the well too many times. You had 3, max maybe 4 shots out of it in one night if you were having that many bad streaks. But I've actually talked to a couple of different die manufacturers, because what I really want somebody to make is a D20 out there that's a custom D20 that, forget trying to hide extra 20s or extra 1s on it. Take off the 3 and the 5 and put an extra 16 and an 18 on it, because nobody's looking for an extra 16, right? Nobody's going to notice that there's 2 16s on a D20. And when I told Craig from Black Oak that, his eyes got really big. He's like, man, you're evil, but I'm going to look into it.
I'm not sure you're right about that, though, Brant. When that phony 16 comes up and the numbers surrounding it are not the right numbers, we're fucking nerds, okay? I think, I'm not saying everybody's going to spot that. I'm saying somebody's going to spot that.
But there are enough variations on the way in which the numbers on the D20 land that you could probably disguise it.
Maybe it's possible. I await a prototype.
Yes, I do
this
too.
marvelous
I brought
device.
It up like 4 years ago. I haven't seen the prototype yet.
There you go. Now, I instead of having the streak breaker, I have a blowtorch to punish the dice with when they misbehave, like bad children.
Years and years ago, Broken Token, when they made their modular dice towers where you could get like 5 or 6 different pieces and make your 2-story dice tower that had all the different modular pieces in between. One of the modular pieces was the dice jail, where you could put a die in jail and it got to watch all the other dice tumble down the dice tower past it, where it wasn't invited to play anymore. I thought that was incredibly nerdy and incredibly incredibly petty all at once.
We have
No,
a habit
somebody's
of
selling
calling
a
cans
dice dummy
sanitizer
chair.
and trying to cleanse dice of bad influences when they're rolling badly.
Yeah.
I've got enough dice. I could just throw the bad dice away, to be fair.
And
But I do have
notice.
streak breaker dice, but they must be used only in the proper circumstances because it's a percentile pair. So it's only good for percentile rolls. And it's only Rollmaster, RuneQuest, or Harnmaster that use percentiles that I play anyway.
I was
Against the
gonna say,
Dark
there's others, because Phoenix Command was percentile.
Well, yeah, Cthulhu and that whole thing. There's a lot. There's plenty, but they're not all percentile rolls.
Yes. The flip side of that is nobody played Phoenix Command. People suffered through Phoenix Command.
I'm not sure they even suffered through it, to be completely honest. I always smelled a lack of playtesting involved in that analysis project.
As we wrap up the discussion on OCS here, one of the things that I did want to get back around to is as we're looking at the OCS series, right? The pantheon of OCS games that are out there. I did want to get your guys' opinions on sort of what do you think is the quintessential archetype of the OCS game, as well as what some of the best and worst entry points might be for someone who's never taken the plunge on OCS and might be interested in exploring it. Like, hey, here's a good starting point. By God, do not touch this one if it's your first OCS game. But then also maybe kind of in the middle somewhere, what is the one that you think is the ultimate archetype or embodiment of the OCS series amongst the current ones? Gary, what do you think? Tackle either one of those first.
I think if you ask somebody who is not an OCS player, I think they're going to tell you that the archetypical OCS game is Case Blue, because it's the one that's probably best known. It's got the most notoriety, for good or ill, right? If you talk to OCS players, I think you'll get a variety of different answers. I mean, I've talked to people who say Burma is their favorite OCS game. I have had a fabulous time with both Sicily games. My personal favorite was probably Baltic Gap. It might now be the Third Winter. I think I will enjoy playing Forgotten Battles again. But I don't think it's going to be like a favorite over Third Winter, because you could get more of the big sweeping armor breakthrough type stuff in Third Winter than you can in Forgotten Battles, just based on the terrain. I think relatively few people will tell you Beyond the Rhine. I think it's one of the OCS games that I've played that I think functions less well than some of the others, due to a problem with the setup, not the setup, but the start date of the campaign scenario. I think is really the biggest problem. If you just push it back 2 turns, I think it would be better. Entry points.
You can't house rule that. I mean,
well, yeah, you could. Well, what are the historical starting positions on the 5 days into the campaign? Right? I don't know. You'd have to do research and stuff. So it's, yes, you could, but you would not be. It's something rather important happens in the first 2 to 3 turns, historically, that there's just Operation Market Garden. There's no good reason for the British to attempt such an asinine thing. And it should happen on like turn 3. And I feel like, why not just start the game on turn 3 and the airborne's already on the ground, and you can decide to leave them out to dry or go get them, or try to go get them. That's up to you. You got maybe 2 turns to do it. And I think that's cool. That gives them a decision to make right off the bat. And instead they choose to start a couple turns ahead of time. So I think there's just no good wargamer reason to do anything like that. I think you can find better uses for the British Airborne than that.
Okay.
So as far as entry point, there's a number of small ones. Either of the magazine games are good. Sicily 2 or Luzon. Luzon is smaller. Sicily 2 is a fairly meaty game. It's just very small by OCS standards. Luzon is a very lean game, and OCS players could play it. And it took me and Alan like an hour and a half to play it, something like that, with the setup. So it's super duper easy. Reluctant Enemies was kind of designed as an entry point, but that's out of print, hard to get now, expensive. Same deal with Tunisia 2. Folks might have good luck just buying Tunisia 1, which can be had for much less money, and you could play it with the new rules, which I would recommend. So that's pretty much. I've done entire videos about these exact questions. So
yeah, well, but that requires somebody to like hang up on the podcast and go find the videos. So.
Don't do that, folks.
James, what do you think? Like the quintessential archetypal OCS game, it might be Case Blue, but I mean, let's face it, most folks know Case Blue just because it's the punchline. Whenever somebody says, "Hey, what war game should I do?" Case Blue, right? It's at this point, it's the wargaming equivalent of yelling out Freebird at a rock concert.
Yeah, it really, and I've done it, and you probably have too. But it's stale now, folks.
Yes.
So in some ways, I'd agree. It's Case Blue or it's Guderian's Blitzkrieg 2. It's one of the giant esports games. But another one that I'd put up as being sort of a quintessential OCS game is Smolensk, which I played once by Vassal, played it with Guy Wild, and I was the Germans. And it was a wild, hair-raising experience for both of us because the Germans, you have got to go, 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 go. You cannot slack. You cannot stop. You must punch and punch and punch and punch to the absolute limit of your possible ability. And yet your supply situation is awful. I was spending every last scrap of supply I got every single turn in order to keep punching. And on his end, he had more supply, he had more stuff, but he knew that any one place I chose to attack, I would win. But how does he derail me? By giving me too many options, by giving me multiple dilemmas that I can't solve all of them. So that's a great thing. From a personal standpoint, one of the great gaming experiences of my life was Hubba's Pocket. Many years ago, living in Glasgow, my wife and I were playing with a friend of ours. They were not as good with the system as I was, so I played as the Germans. And we knew who was going to lose. I was, because the Germans are fated to lose in that game. It's a question of when and not if. But it also meant that I could pull out all the stops on my end. I felt perfectly free to give them advice. And we had a game that was simultaneously very collegial and very, very hard fought. And we went through a series of those, and I lost more slowly every time. So that was nice. Plus, having been part of the crew for the 1941-42 part of the Crimea game, I will put in a plug for that. Which also moves into entry points. And I know that Guy and I, in working on the Crimea game, which I helped him testing, I helped him sort of refine it, but he was very much the lead for the 41-42 half of that. Part of our thinking was build it as something that would be easy for people to get into because it's a smaller one-map game. It's got a reduced counter set. And we tried to make sure there would be a minimal number of special rules. Same thing applies to Luzon. Same largely applies to Reluctant Enemies if you find it. But the other advice I have for people if they're looking to get into OCS, and this I think applies to war games in general, complexity, size, scale, all of that, to my mind, is less important than your personal interest in the topic. If you're interested in it, if you think that whichever campaign, whichever operation you've chosen is just really cool, then you're going to like it, even if it's complicated, because you're going to be motivated to saw through it. Whereas if people have told you, oh, you ought to do this one because it's the intro, and you're saying, I don't really care about that campaign at all, then your own lack of interest is going to torpedo you in getting through the supposedly simpler situation.
Spoken like a wise old wizard. Without the beard.
Calling me old.
I was about to say, you've met him. You know he doesn't have the beard to be the wise old wizard.
Well, you could be a beardless wizard, I guess. I mean, you know.
He could be, the potions master somewhere, maybe.
Well, I don't know. Something. I'm not a wizard expert.
Really?
I kind of am, actually, but,
That's kind of why I'm
saying. I just didn't think it through before I said it.
Thou doth protest too much. I've seen your bookshelves.
I've literally got a set of wizard robes around here somewhere.
And no one listening to this is the least bit surprised.
Nope.
Guys, as we wrap this up, I appreciate y'all taking the time to do this deeper dive into OCS. It was one of the things that we wanted to do this season, was to try and pick a couple of fairly narrow topics and dig a little deeper into some of them this season. And so I appreciate you taking the time to do that. I do want to, do once more kind of around the room here, if there's a final thought you wanted to toss out there about the OCS system, maybe something we hadn't discussed that you wanted to mention, or just kind of sum up some of the things that we had discussed here tonight. James, I'll start with you, because if I start with Gary, we might be here for another 30 minutes.
He's right.
I guess my overall comment would be that people often, you hear about, OCS, it's insanely complex and You know, very hard to get your head around, so on and so forth. And I would counter that instead you should dive in and try it. That it is, on the one hand, yes, there are a lot of rules, but particularly for most of the games, I'm looking at DAC 1 at the first version of DAK as the exception. There aren't a lot of exceptions to the rules. The rules are logical. And I believe that the better you know your World War II operational history, the more the rules you'll look at them and say, oh, okay, well, that's the way it ought to work. I get that. And you should give it a swing. It is a excellent system. It really is rewarding to play.
Go.
I'll echo what Jim said about Smolensk. It packs an awfully complete OCS experience into one map. And it's it is not a simple game system, but it does have an internal logic that you will pick up sooner or later. And once you get the hang of it, it's tons of fun to play. Big or small. Some of the smaller games are you don't have to play an 18 map gigantic thing. Plenty of one map scenarios in all the games, really.
I still contend that I want someone to make the set of DAC maps on rollers so that you can play them on a small table and just roll the map to whichever part of it you happen to need at that point in time.
Can't do that for Campaign for North Africa, unfortunately. You need the whole map at all times.
Yes, but that's because it's CNA and there's a lot of dumb stuff in there.
Yes, that's because it's insane.
Yes. It's not a game, it's a social experiment. But I think it could work for DAC. So, gentlemen, thank you very much for the time. I definitely appreciate y'all digging in on OCS here. I didn't think it would be all that hard to convince y'all to pontificate on this particular topic. And you did not disappoint. So I definitely appreciate that. Audience, thank you guys for listening. We've still got a couple more deep dives we're going to do. We're going to look at the Battles of the American Revolution coming up. We're going to look on the digital side. We're going to dig deeper into the Total War series because we've got a couple of definite Total War players hanging out on the Dragoons site, and we're going to.
I'm making a face right now.
That's fine. Make the face. It's cool. You're off camera. But we've got a couple of guys that happen to really love the system, and so we're going to let those guys pontificate on that system for a bit. And again, coming up in a couple of weeks, we're going to have a quasi-live episode similar to what I did last year, where when I'm at Gamma Expo, I'm going to talk to a bunch of different folks, and we'll stitch it all together into one episode as a part of that conversation. So, James, Gary, thank you all for being here. Appreciate it very much. Audience,
always a pleasure.
You're welcome.
Audience, thank you guys for listening. We'll catch you next time on another episode of Mentioning Dispatches.